Uh, Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you're logging in from. My name is Manan Desai, and I am the Director of Asian Pacific Islander American Studies, at the Asian Pacific Islander American Studies program at the University of Michigan, where I'm also an Associate Professor in the Department of American Culture. I wanted to start off with a land acknowledgement. As a member of this university community, I'd like to acknowledge that U of M's origins come from a land grant from the Anishinaabe, including the Odawa, the Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi, as well as the Wyandot people. Thank you all for joining us for today's event, which is sponsored by the APIA Studies Program. It's really my great pleasure and honor to introduce today's speaker. Professor Miley Arwin is an assistant professor of history and gender studies at the University of Utah. She's a Native Hawaiian feminist scholar who works on issues of race, gender, science, and colonialism in Hawaii and the broader Pacific. Before joining the faculty at Utah, Professor Arwin was an assistant professor at UC Riverside, and she also earned her PhD at the University of California, San Diego. Professor Arwin's book, Possessing Polynesians, The Science of Settler Colonial Whiteness in Hawaii and Oceania, was published with Duke University Press in 2019, and it won honorable mention for Best History Book from the Association of Asian American Studies in 2021. Possessing Polynesians examines the 19th and 20th century history of social scientists declaring Polynesians as, quote, almost white. In the book, Professor Arwin argues that such scientific studies contributed to a settler colonial logic of possession through whiteness, and through this logic, indigenous Polynesians as a people and Polynesia as a place became the natural possessions of white settlers. The book also examines how Polynesians have long challenged this logic in ways that regenerate indigenous ways of relating to each other. Today's lecture will examine Professor Arwin's newest project, examining the institutionalization of Native Hawaiian children and other children of color in territorial-era Hawaii. So just one last note, today's event is presented as a Zoom webinar, and after the presentation, we will have time for a Q&A session. So you can type your questions out as they arise in the chat box, and I'll do my best to tend to them, or you can virtually raise your hand and I can unmute you and you can proceed to ask a question. So there's a couple of different ways in which you can ask a question, which we'll work through at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Professor Arwin. Thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks so much, Manan, and thanks to Lisa Toon for also helping organize all the logistics. It's a pleasure to be able to speak with you all today. And in the chat, I'm just going to put a link to an access copy of my talk. So if you're someone who would benefit just from reading along the text while I'm presenting, there's a Google Doc link in the chat for you. Also, for access, the live transcript function has been enabled. So if you want to see the kind of auto-generated captions that Zoom makes, you can press on the CC button at the bottom of the Zoom page. So yes, so aloha mai kako, hello everyone. Again, thank you for hosting me. Also for accessibility, as part of my introduction, I'll just kind of describe my screen. So I'm a light-skinned Native Hawaiian woman with long dark hair in my 30s. I'm wearing brown glasses, a maroon colored shirt, and some gold circular earrings. I'm seated in front of my computer, and behind me is a bookshelf. And I'm speaking today from my home in Salt Lake City, Utah. And I acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. It's my intention that my words here today remain in good relation with the Ute, Shoshone, Paiute, and Goshute peoples, as well as with the Anishinaabe, including Ottawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi, and Wyandot peoples whose lands the University of Michigan occupies. So my talk today is about the history of a number of interconnected institutions that incarcerated Native Hawaiian and other children of color in Hawaii in the early 20th century. This research, which I'm still in the middle of, I hope will become my second book. And some of you might have read my first book. I'm also happy to answer questions about that in the Q&A if you have them. And hopefully you'll see many of the same kind of concerns about questioning social science that were in the first book continues in the second project. Yeah, so while the institutions I write about have called themselves schools or homes, you'll notice that I often purposely emphasize the language of incarceration and institutionalization, because these places kept children often against their will and their families' wills, frequently for indeterminate sentences. It could be years, even decades long, at least until they had reached the age of majority, which was usually 21, but sometimes could be older for women, especially. So it is by design easy to forget this if we only ever call them schools and homes. And so, this, it kind of seems silly to say it, but this is a really difficult history. So I also want to begin with a content warning. This history is obviously painful, and as I argue, connected to other settler colonial histories of the forced removal and institutionalization of Indigenous children, including news emerging over the last year about newly discovered burials at residential schools in Canada. So while I will not discuss in detail any physical abuse or death in the cases that I'm talking about, the institutionalization of children is nonetheless distressing, to say the least. In the Hawaiian language, kaumaha is the word for both heavy or burden down and sadness or grief. And I think I'm just always thinking of how well kaumaha describes these mo'olelo or stories and histories. They really weigh on me. So e malama pono kako, I remind us to take care of ourselves. Please don't hesitate to leave or turn off your cameras, or I guess no one's cameras on except mine, but just do what you need to do on the Zoom, mute me or whatever as you need throughout the talk. Okay, with that, let me open my slides. Okay. So I'll begin with the story that drew me into this project, which I found through a sociological interview I came across doing research for my first book. In 1929, Dorothy Wu, and this name is a pseudonym. I don't use the real names of any of the actual children that are named in the archives throughout the talk, but I use pseudonyms. So in 1929, Dorothy Wu, a multiracial Native Hawaiian and Chinese teenager, suddenly found herself a ward of the Salvation Army Girls' Home in Honolulu, Hawaii, then a US territory. Until her institutionalization, Dorothy had worked as a maid in the home of Princess Abigail Campbell Kavana Nakoa, who was a member of the elite or ruling royal class of the formerly independent Hawaiian kingdom. To Dorothy's bewilderment, the princess abruptly fired Dorothy for so-called associating with boys and recommended her commitment to the girls' home, where she could so-called be better cared for. Dorothy found the Salvation Army matrons mean. She complained that they discriminated against darker girls like her. And after 6 months, Dorothy ran away. Her escape soon landed her in juvenile court, which sentenced her to the Kawailoa Training School for girls, where matrons worked to shape so-called wayward girls, the majority of whom were Native Hawaiian and or Asian, into so-called proper and modern American women. So Dorothy's narrative is a particularly striking example of what disability studies scholar Susan Birch terms trans-institutionalization, meaning the process of moving individuals from one variety of institution to another as a part of sustained containment, surveillance, and slow erasure, which she argues is a potent type of settler colonial removal. Dorothy Wu's story gives one example of the path this trans-institutionalization could take. Though Dorothy's story ends at the Kawailoa Training School in the archival record that I've accessed so far, many other children found themselves on even longer paths of trans-institutionalization. Based on intelligent quotient testing, IQ testing conducted regularly at the training schools, children deemed feeble-minded would often be transferred to Waimano Home for the feeble-minded. And especially for young men incarcerated at the government Waialeʻe Training School for boys, their so-called delinquency would often get them sent on to Oahu prison. So the traffic between these institutions, the training schools, the home for the feeble-minded, and the prison was really eased by the fact that beginning in 1939, they were all administered under the same Territorial Department of Institutions, along with the Territorial Hospital for the Mentally Ill and various divisions of parole. So on this slide, there's an image of a cover of a report that has just like some sketch drawings of the different buildings at these institutions. And it's from a 1942 report produced by the Department of Institutions. And as Birch argues, the frequency of transfers between such institutions alerts us to the dynamic, interlocking, and far-reaching processes, practices, and experiences that characterize trans-institutionalization as a method of settler colonialism, factors that we might miss if we focus only on histories of particular institutions in isolation. So this book project overall is really about how social scientific knowledge production structured the logic and practices of trans-institutionalization in territorial Hawaii. The institutions that took children included both government-run institutions and private ones run by philanthropic or religious groups like the Salvation Army, Girls' Home that I mentioned before. But because they have the most extensive archival records, so far I'm focusing mostly on the history of 3 institutions operated by the Territory of Hawaiʻi. The Waialeʻe Industrial School for Boys, which opened in 1902, the Kawailoa Training School for Girls that opened in 1929, and the Waimano Home for the Feeble-Minded that opened in 1921. And I'll say a bit more about each later in the talk, but this is this really basic map that I was really proud of myself for making, but just to give, especially folks from Hawaii, if you're familiar with Oahu, kind of just showing you where these institutions were located. Waialeʻe on the North Shore, Waimano Home, kind of overlooking Pearl Harbor, and Kawailoa out just a little bit outside of Kailua on the windward side. Yeah, so the combined rhetorics of correction and care for Hawaii's children at play in these carceral institutions echoed the broader paternalistic justifications for the United States annexing of Hawaii as a territory in 1898, as saving the islands from both other colonial empires and a Hawaiian kingdom that white settlers characterized as uncivilized and childish. So in this view, US settler colonialism could be portrayed as a progressive uplift of Native Hawaiians rather than the structural cause of their increasing losses of land, language, and culture. Social science provided the territorial government language and so-called evidence with which to argue that their practices of institutionalization were modern, progressive, and humane, even when the official reports of those institutions suggested otherwise. The territorial government repeatedly used the scientific imprimatur of work by those like psychologist Stanley Porteous, who was a professor at the University of Hawaii during this period, who was a special proponent of intelligence testing. He even created his own IQ test, which was called the Porteous Maze test that's shown here. And yeah, I'll say more about Porteous throughout the talk. But so the government also looked to models of industrial and training schools and homes for the so-called feeble-minded in the continental US and internationally as justifications for institutionalizing Native Hawaiian and immigrants of color. So to date, no other scholar has written critically about these territorial-era institutions in Hawaii, and there's really not been any widespread recognition of the ways that they functioned as a form of settler colonial child removal. I argue that it is essential to do so. Conventional histories of this time in Hawaii have largely overlooked Native Hawaiian stories, focusing more on labor histories of immigrant populations, and presented the political shifts from the Hawaiian Kingdom to the Territory of Hawaii and then to Hawaii as the 50th state of the Union starting in 1959 as largely smooth and inevitable. So taking seriously the colonial violence and damage done through institutionalization offers a much more complex and troubling picture of the territorial period, as well as the work that we still have left to do towards decolonization. So these institutions can also be understood more broadly as a kind of violence that worked to keep Native Hawaiians from more explicit resistance to US colonization. In this respect, they're very much in keeping with Native American boarding schools, First Nations residential schools, and Australian dormitories for stolen Aboriginal children. And just like in those other contexts, so too in Hawaii, the training schools and the home for the feeble-minded constantly frame their missions as ones of so-called civilizing and preparing children for modern life as so-called useful members of society. Native Hawaiian and other non-white forms of kinship, intimacy, and care were continually pathologized as backwards and incompatible with modern life. So as Susan Birch writes in the context of the history of Native Americans incarcerated at the Canton Asylum for so-called insane Indians in South Dakota, the violence of Canton Asylum was collective as well as individual, and did and continues to do much to break a fundamental tenet of many Indigenous communities, that of being a good relative. The Hawaii State Archives records on the training schools, which form the foundation of my research on this topic, are filled with official reports and correspondence, but also with letters from parents and other kin asking for their children back. When examined from this angle, the child removal policies of the territorial-era institutions and their afterlives perhaps helps to explain why so many Native Hawaiians in the territorial period and beyond felt compelled to make sure that their children spoke only good English rather than Hawaiian or Pidgin, and to think of themselves as American rather than Hawaiian. Though these sentiments have often been presented as robust consent to Hawaii's annexation by the United States and eventual statehood, I suggest that there are also evidence of families desperate to keep their children and terrified of losing them to indeterminate sentences in a government institution. So yeah, let's see. Before I say a little bit more about each of those three institutions that I focus on, I'll just briefly highlight here two kind of major differences between the territorial institutions in Hawaii and other contexts of Indigenous child removal policies. The first is that not all or even most Native Hawaiian children were taken to these institutions. Only those who have been deemed so-called delinquent, wayward, immoral, or feeble-minded by a court were taken to the government institutions. It was a little fuzzier on, there could be less legal reasons for children to be taken to like the Salvation Army home. But yeah, so this is potentially a large difference in terms of the raw numbers of children taken compared to more general targeting of Indigenous children taken to boarding and residential schools in the North American context. However, we actually do not yet have an accurate count of the numbers who are taken to these institutions, though this is one area that I hope my research will be able to contribute to. And even if a relative minority of Native Hawaiian children were ever taken to these institutions, I believe that they still operated as a powerful threat to Native Hawaiian families who may have been coerced into assimilation as a way to keep their children from institutionalization. And then a second major difference in the Hawaiian context is that though Native Hawaiian children were consistently made up a disproportionate majority of the children incarcerated at the training schools and at Waimano Home, they were not the only racial group that the territorial government targeted and detained in these places. So Asian and other non-white immigrant groups in Hawaii were also confined to these institutions, including Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Filipino, and Puerto Rican children. That Native Hawaiian children were not the only ones in these schools and homes may be one reason why these institutions have generally not been understood as being of a piece with the other settler colonial institutions that stole Indigenous children. But I argue that they should be. Those other racial groups largely arrived to Hawaii when it was still an independent kingdom, and many had formed families with Native Hawaiians. Thus, many Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, Filipinos, and others who also had their own cultures that could be seen as threatening to the territory were also seen as in need of settler colonial intervention. Many who were not Native Hawaiians themselves had been integrated into Native Hawaiian forms of kinship and ways of life that, while targeted for settler colonial replacement, had still never quite been eradicated. For example, the common Native Hawaiian adoptive practice of hanai, in which children were raised by family or friends who were not the biological parents, was especially targeted as a cause of delinquent children by white progressive reformers in Hawaii at this time. White reformers argued that hanai caused confusion and anxiety in children, though there was little evidence of this. And overall, incarcerating largely Native Hawaiian children, but also children of other races who otherwise may have identified as Hawaiian nationals rather than American nationals, was in keeping with the push to laud Hawaii as a multiracial melting pot, but only if that racial mixing resulted in almost white Americans. So there's a lot more to say about these differences and similarities to other forms of settler colonial child removal and institutionalization. And I'd be happy to say more in Q&A. But for now, let me move into further analysis of the social scientific discourses that dominated each institution. Yeah. So each of these three institutions really stake their mission on rehabilitating, curing, or caring for certain pathologies that were robustly described in sociological and psychological literature of the time, including delinquency at the Waialeʻe Training School for Boys or Industrial School, which usually referred to petty crimes or truancy. Immorality at the Kawailoa Training School for Girls, which almost always referred to perceived sexual transgressions. Sometimes it was even referred to as like sexual delinquency, sometimes more vaguely referred to as waywardness. And then finally, feeble-mindedness at the Waimano Home for the feeble-minded, which usually referred to low intelligence as determined by IQ testing, like I mentioned before, or other like forms of psychological evaluation. So these discourses were all really deeply intertwined and appeared at each institution, yet social scientific knowledge claimed to be able to precisely identify, isolate, and or in some cases rehabilitate these different categories as distinct pathologies that these different specialized institutions would help care for or cure. Such knowledge, which in turn structured and justified the Territory of Hawaii's policies of trans-institutionalization, was fundamentally grounded in some settler ideas of race, indigeneity, gender, sexuality, labor, and ableism. So the discovery of feeble-mindedness at Waialeʻe or Kawailoa could be the cause for transfer to Waimano, but the discourse of feeble-mindedness also undergirded particular fears white settlers had about delinquent boys and immoral girls. While IQ tests at Waialeʻe purported that nearly 40% of those young men were quote, of very low mental classification, social scientists argued that they were nonetheless fit or could be made fit through Waialeʻe's training for agricultural work on the nearby pineapple and sugar plantations. Conversely, findings of low intelligence in young women was of greater concern because of an understanding common across the United States at this time that so-called feeble-minded women were direct threats to the national gene pool and thus more deserving of indefinite institutionalization and or sterilization. So this is one reason why the majority of those sentenced to the girls' training school, Kawailoa, were sent there for offenses of so-called sexual immorality, as settler fears attach not only to Native Hawaiian female sexual agency in general, but also more specifically to the kind of children Native Hawaiian women might give birth to and what kind of threats those children might pose to white settler notions of the nation. So in the archives of these institutions, however, the self-assured ability of settler social science and territorial public policy to effectively care for and cure children of delinquency, immorality, and feeble-mindedness is shown to be in practice deeply contested and constantly challenged by the children incarcerated at these institutions and their families, and even sometimes as well as by the institution's own administrations and governing boards. So I read stories like Dorothy Wu's, who I began with, who repeatedly ran away and fought her trans institutionalization, not simply as evidence of Native Hawaiian resistance per se, though it certainly is that. The thing is, resistance to unjust settler colonial systems is not especially surprising to me as a Native Hawaiian person, despite conventional settler historiography finding little to no resistance from Native Hawaiians during the territorial period. I take for granted that many Native Hawaiians, as well as Asian and other immigrants, resisted in complex and deeply human ways, though this is also supported by the Settler Colonial Archive, which is just filled with all of these accounts of runaways, strikes, and even riots at these institutions. So I analyze stories like Dorothy Wu's less as kind of like proof of resistance in a pat way, and more as the glimpse of how regular people under the Hawaii territorial government were still trying to live according to a different set of relations and different non-settler forms of care and responsibility, or kuleana. So yeah, with that framing, let me get into sharing a little bit more about each of these institutions and these three pathologies: delinquency, immorality, and feeble-mindedness. Yeah, I'll just go back to the map so as I talk about these three, you can kind of maybe imagine their settings. So located on 733 acres on the remote north shore of Oahu, the Waialeʻe Industrial School for Boys, which was also called the Waialeʻe Training School for Boys, the name changed at some point, and but they're kind of referenced interchangeably sometimes in the records. It opened in 1902. And it sought to definitively remove youth from what officials understood to be the ill effects of urban living in Honolulu. The boys incarcerated at Waialeʻe were commonly committed because of charges of delinquency. And so a delinquent, as defined by territorial law, was any minor who violates any law of the territory or any county or city or any city and county ordinance, or who is incorrigible, vicious, or immoral, or who is growing up in idleness or crime, or who is a habitual truant from school, or who habitually wanders about the streets and public places during school hours without lawful occupation or employment. So you can kind of hear a very capacious definition of what a delinquent is. And also note that such a definition was particularly concerned with those who did not stay in the rules allotted to them, whether it was being truant from school or just a boy enjoying themselves in a public space. So such a broad definition of a delinquent left enormous subjective judgment to law enforcement and courts. And again, notably, the majority of the young men sent to Waialeʻe were Native Hawaiian. Boys at the school trained and worked largely in agriculture, both producing food to sustain the community of the school and on the sugar and pineapple plantations located nearby. Yet from its earliest days, Waialeʻe's isolation, along with the school being routinely short-staffed, in part because it was difficult to recruit teachers to live so far away from town at Waialeʻe, was also a weak point. So boys frequently ran away and they could be really hard to recapture. The school largely blamed the delinquency of the boys on the failures of their families. So a 1921 report said, in the main, these charges have come from homes which have failed in the proper training of their children. This was perhaps the key difference in how territorial officials understood children, still understood as innocent to some extent, as different than adults, that their bad behavior could be attributed to their families or to a so-called poor home, instead of being seen as only an individual character flaw. So in the view of administrators of the training schools, the sentencing of a wayward boy at Waialeʻe from a bad family was not punitive to the boy, for whom it was a kind of rescue, though in effect it punished the family by taking away their child. If his home is bad or his environment debasing, he should not be punished. He should be replanted, reads a memo to the Board of Industrial Schools from circa 1930. The memo further defines the job of an industrial school as, quote, to reduce the population of the schools by constant and of course careful transplanting of the bulk of its entrants back into normal social environments. So this so-called transplanting would not return boys to their so-called poor homes, but to parole jobs and home placements, which kind of like a foster home system, after the desirable and disciplining of the mind and body at Waialeʻe. Such comments about the need to transplant boys after their time at the school were at least partially concerned with the high costs of running to the school. And so they always kind of wanted to find ways, in theory, they wanted to find ways to get the boys out of the school so they didn't have to pay for their food and everything. And so these kind of comments were submitted along with arguments for how the school could be maintained at a lower cost. So the parole, the ideas about parole were really key to ideas about keeping the cost of these institutions low. However, in practice, many children were still kept at Waialeʻe and Kawailoa for indeterminate sentences. So the other reason often remarked upon to explain the cause of delinquency of the boys incarcerated at Waialeʻe was their so-called low mentality. So in a 1934 report, the superintendent of Waialeʻe notes the need for more psychological testing and the transfer of so-called morons and feeble-minded boys to Waimano Home. So Stanley Porteous, as I mentioned before, he was a psychologist at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. He was really involved with research at Waialeʻe, Kawailoa, and Waimano Home. And he unabashedly believed that what he called the Hawaiian and so-called Oriental boys were mentally inferior to Caucasians. As he argued in his 1926 book, co-authored with Marjorie Babcock, Temperament and Race, he argued that Hawaii's non-white population, including the Portuguese, he counted Portuguese as non-white, that overall Hawaii's population, non-white population, averaged 73.3% of the intelligence of white people, with Filipinos and Hawaiians having the so-called most racial defects. Thus, he noted that spending much money on attempting to seriously educate such populations would be akin to, quote, helping lame dogs over stiles, and when they are over, they are still lame. To Porteous, then, the only real goal of Waialeʻe was to shape its wards into agricultural labor. Yeah, so that kind of gives you a sense of some of the discourses around Waialeʻe and the like male delinquency. And now I'll talk a bit more about Kawailoa. So like Waialeʻe, the Kawailoa Training School for Girls, also sometimes called the Manawili Training School for Girls, it opened in 1929. It was also located in a rural environment removed from urban Honolulu, on 363 acres on the windward side of Oahu, outside of the town of Kailua. So instead of reforming the petty crimes of truancy or delinquency focused on at the boys' school, the crimes and methods of rehabilitation at the girls' school were focused on perceived sexual immorality. Girls were committed to Kawailoa in large part for perceived sex offenses or sex delinquencies. As with Waialeʻe, the blame for this immorality was the child's family, and by extension, Native Hawaiian culture more broadly. So like a 1938 report notes, the majority of the girls are committed because of sex delinquencies, are part Hawaiian, and are from families known to many social agencies. As with Dorothy Wu, whose story I began with, a sex delinquency did not need to involve actual proven sexual relations, but merely the appearance of improper association with boys or men. The primary end goal of rehabilitation at Kawailoa was to train girls to be more moral and equipped to perform domestic labor so they could work as maids in wealthy homes until they're married and kept homes for themselves. Of course, the irony with this kind of mission, right, especially with Dorothy's story, was that she was already working as a maid before. So like, it's not like she actually needed training to be a maid, right? So anyway, one acceptable reason for parole from Kawailoa, and to some territorial officials, the most desired outcome was if a girl was to be married. Such marriages required the prior permission of the juvenile court and or the Board of Industrial Schools. And we can think of this transfer from Kawailoa to marriage as a different but related kind of trans-institutionalization, as transfers from the training schools to Oahu Prison or Waimano Home. Marriage was a territorial institution too, which sought to rehabilitate common Native Hawaiian forms of intimacy and kinship into heteropatriarchal structure that aligned with white settler colonial norms. Legal marriage was not uniformly valued by Native Hawaiians, and common law relationships, which could be easily dissolved as desired by either party, were and still are widely accepted. So too, same-sex relationships and non-binary gender identities and roles were traditionally valued and accepted. So concerns over sexual relationships between the young women incarcerated at Kawailoa is often commented on in the archival records. A 1938 report makes note of a recent policy change allowing, quote, the presence of friends other than relatives on visiting days so that boyfriends may call on girls and correspond with older girls. This situation has practically eliminated homosexual practices, which used to be so rampant at the school, end quote. Still, this concern was really very active in 1945, as noted in a handbook given to the girls on their arrival at Kawailoa, which emphasized as a rule that holding hands, kissing other girls, and walking with arms around each other are forbidden. So-called boy haircuts are not permitted. Girls are expected to be friendly with all, but not too intimate with any of the other students. So such rules make really clear how potential lesbian or queer relationships among those incarcerated at Kawailoa were threatening because of how they went against heteronormative expectations, but also because of the pleasure and intimacy, whether sexual or not, that could threaten to break down the discipline of the school. So though a heterosexual marriage was presented as the model of success for the future of a girl incarcerated at Kawailoa, presumably one of the reasons why the sexual immorality of Native Hawaiian and Asian girls was of such concern at Kawailoa was the prevalent assumption by social scientists and the general public at this time that they would reproduce similarly immoral children who would also not be beholden to the white settler colonial norms of territorial Hawaii. This concern attached to so-called feeble-minded women in particular ways. As historian Michael Rambis puts in his studies of a girls' training school in Illinois, so-called feeble-minded women reproduce at a much higher rate than their normal-minded counterparts, swelling the ranks of society's so-called unfit. So such concerns nationally spurred many involuntary or coerced sterilization campaigns in many states in the early 20th century. However, this eugenic concern also justified indefinite segregation of feeble-minded women, especially of childbearing age, from society. So in my research so far, I haven't really seen records of sterilization campaigns in Hawaii. But this discourse about the danger of feeble-minded women reproducing at high rates certainly helps explain why the immorality of Native Hawaiian young women would have been so important to check and rehabilitate. Okay, so that gives you a little sense of kind of that discourse and pathology around immorality at Kawailoa. And then, yeah, I'll just have a few more things to say about so-called feeble-mindedness at Waimano Home. So when children incarcerated at Waialeʻe or Kawailoa were determined, often through the results of IQ testing, to be feeble-minded, they could be transferred on to the Waimano Home for the Feeble-Minded, which opened in 1921. Waimano was situated on 612 acres of territorial land overlooking Pearl City and Pearl Harbor on the leeward side of Oahu. And Waimano held both children and adults, although very notably in the archival records, all of its wards are usually referred to as children, even though some of them are actually adults. But commitment required the ruling of a circuit court judge, but also any adult relative, guardian, or custodian of the individual sought to be committed, or any authorized social agency or an agent of any governmental department or bureau may file in court an application for the commitment of the individual into Waimano Home. And a certificate stating that the individual is in need of institutionalization was required by the court and had to be verified by a committee consisting of a psychiatrist, a clinical psychologist, and a psychiatric social worker. And again, you can kind of hear many of the kind of experts who were called on in these cases were being trained or worked at the University of Hawaii. Before the opening of Waimano, so-called feeble-minded children or juvenile defectives, as one study put it, would have been committed to the Territory's training schools. But as those schools became overcrowded and their superintendents argued that so-called feeble-minded wards made their gendered rehabilitation of the delinquent boys and immoral girls more difficult, they advocated for a specialized institution which would become Waimano. So as with Waialeʻe and Kawailoa, Native Hawaiians were also overrepresented at Waimano. And many of those incarcerated at Waimano were kept there for their entire lives. A 1942 report estimates that 68% of the total population will remain there for their entire lifetime because they do not fall into the so-called higher class of the feeble-minded who are taught many things and when possible placed on parole. So this report further broke down how the feeble-minded were categorized, largely according again to the IQ test scores as either moron, imbecile, idiot, and incorrigible. The report said the last named are few in number, fortunately, but require constant vigilance since they are dangerous both to themselves and the attendants. So-called morons IQ is 50 to 69 inclusive, the imbeciles 20 to 49 inclusive, and the idiots below 20. So, I mean, all of these like categories are to some extent meaningless. I mean, they're based on these tests, which are very flawed, right? But according to the people who ran these institutions, they attached a lot of meaning to these different categories. So similar to and inextricably intertwined with official explanations of the causes of delinquency and immorality described by the staff and administrators at Waialeʻe and Kawailoa, the cause of feeble-mindedness was understood to rest with the child's family. Though feeble-mindedness was generally understood as a genetic handicap, which was hereditary and thus not always kind of the intentional fault of a family, there was also a sense that the family was irresponsible for having children to whom such traits would be passed on. So this was shaped by the fears mentioned above that I mentioned before in relation to potential pregnancies by so-called feeble-minded women, and feeble-minded women were so-called reproducing at greater numbers than average and dragging down the racial stock of the nation. In a 1942 report on Waimano, the pathologization and presumed genetic nature of feeble-mindedness, as well as delinquency, immorality, and criminality more broadly is really clear from this quote. And yeah, it's on the slide for you as well. This report says one case was cited in which there were 13 members in the family originally. There have been 4 deaths in the past few years. 4 are at Waimano Home, 2 are in Oahu Prison, and both Kawailoa Training School for girls and Waialeʻe Training School for boys have representatives in the same family. Does not this one example, and there are others comparable to it, prove the necessity of indexing the feeble-minded in the territory and of institutionalizing the most urgent cases? So this quote kind of very well presents the institutionalization of many members of the same family throughout the carceral institutions of the Territory of Hawaiʻi as evidence of the supposed dangers of feeble-mindedness. So in the race is not mentioned in this quote, for many reading this report, given the overrepresentation of Native Hawaiians at all of these institutions, it would likely have been a Native Hawaiian family that they pictured. So this use of the discourse of the feeble-minded as a so-called danger to modern settler society is a really potent form of settler ableism, which is the term used by American Studies scholar Jessica Cowling to draw attention to the ways that settler colonialism is structured by ableist logics. The assumption that Waimano Home would segregate and properly care for the feeble-minded was a settler ableist one that took for granted that everyone should aspire to white settler forms of intelligence, especially including white settler ideas of productivity, given how Waimano emphasized training and preparing those incarcerated for jobs or at least work in the gardens at Waimano. And certainly the other institutions really emphasized those ideas of work and productivity as well. Settler ableism also structured the assumptions that dominated all of the institutions that non-white forms of care, including Native Hawaiian families caring for their own children, were not sufficient, modern, or appropriate. Okay. So just to wrap up, to end, I just want to share a little bit about how some children attempted to remain connected to their own forms of family and kinship despite their incarceration and pathologization by the Territory of Hawaiʻi. While official reports from the institutions documented frequent runaways and explained the cause of running away as largely the excitement of the chase, as one report put it, firsthand accounts emphasize the desire to maintain familial relationships and a sense of self beyond the institution. So for example, in a 1938, there was a newsletter produced at Kawailoa Training School called the Red Roof Weekly that was written by girls at the school. And in that in this 1938 edition, a recent runaway named Violet, who was returned to the school, is interviewed. Asked why she ran away, she answers first, one reason because of being my baby's birthday. Another reason was that Mrs. Hoke said I had to behave for 4 or 5 weeks, so I was burned up and took off. The interviewer, who again is another girl at the school, asked, was it really so hard to behave for 4 or 5 weeks? And Violet admits, it's not so hard. But then when asked again why she ran away, she says, oh, for pleasure. So this really small glimpse into the life of a young woman at Kawailoa notes that her reasons for running away had primarily to do with returning to and reconnecting with her family and simply wanting to experience pleasure and live a free life. Violet is referred to in the newsletter as a girl, but actually she's also a mother. She has a baby that she's apparently prevented from seeing regularly, and the note of it being her baby's birthday suggests that it may have been her baby's first birthday, traditionally an especially important milestone that was and still is marked with a large luau or feast and party. So this is another example of how institutionalization broke families and non-settler forms of care. In this case, we see the intergenerational impact as Violet is separated not only from her parents, but also from her own child. So overall, the histories of Waialeʻe, Kawailoa, and Waimano have rarely been featured in official histories of Hawaii, but many people in Hawaii are familiar with these institutions because of family ties and stories lived and passed down to them. These institutions also live on in literal and haunting ways. So Kawailoa, the site of Kawailoa is now the site of the Hawaii Youth Correctional Facility, which is a state juvenile correctional facility. And it currently has plans to rebrand as the Kawailoa Youth and Family Wellness Center. The ruins of some of the buildings at Waialeʻe remain visible from the highway and are well storied as a haunted site. And more recently, I've heard it's become an unsanctioned skate park. So those unruly boys keep coming back there. Waimano is also storied as a haunted place. Officially, the state continues to use some of the buildings as offices, but there are like all these like stories about like movies trying to film there and having lots of incidents. So anyway, by telling the histories of these institutions together, my hope is that we can move away from both uncritical histories of the territorial period in Hawaii and in just passing interest in these sites as kind of haunted and spooky, although they are. With the examples I've shared in my talk today, I have attempted to show how focusing on the ways that these institutions deployed interlocking discourses of delinquency, immorality, and feeble-mindedness offers a critical understanding of the ways that the territory of Hawaii instituted settler colonial hierarchies of race, gender, sexuality, and ability, among others, by pathologizing Native Hawaiian and other non-white forms of care and family. That children and their families consistently resisted institutionalization and attempted to continue to care for each other demonstrates not only their humanity, but a very powerful, if overlooked, critique of settler colonialism during this era. And just kind of one last concluding remarks. Considering the history of these institutions in Hawaii has also pushed me to see that decolonization must be articulated with abolition. Decolonization is about the return of land, but more broadly about the return of our relations. Land is not only land as a matter of earth and water, but land as ancestor or ancestors with whom Indigenous peoples have foundational relation to, one upon which all our other relations are built. So an abolitionist dream of decolonization then is one that seeks the return of land as a foundation for the revitalization of Black, Indigenous, and other non-white, non-settler forms of care, intimacy, and life. And that would supplant not only the need for a physical institution of a training home, an asylum, or a prison, but the very idea of human caging at all. When I think about this history, then I think about the large acreages of each of these institutions, lands that are all still controlled by the state, and in one case, at least still used to incarcerate children. in my ongoing research, I'm searching not only for what kinds of relations we held with these lands before their colonization, but also what kinds of relations we might regenerate with these lands and each other through and after their decolonization. So mahalo nui loa, thank you. And yeah, very happy to take your questions or comments. Let's see, stop.
Thank you so much, Miley. We can't hear the applause, but you know, you can imagine it. Thank you so much for that really wonderful talk. There are some comments in the chat, but let me just, as a matter of procedure, there's a number of ways that you can ask a question. You can put something in the chat and I'd be happy to ask it. You can also use the raised hand function and I can unmute you. You just have to accept being unmuted, or if you understand. So there's already a question from Amy Stillman. So Amy, I'm gonna allow you to talk.
Okay, am I on?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, hi, aloha Miley. Thank you for a wonderful talk and thank you for your research on this really, really important chapter that needs to be much more fully fleshed out. You know, grow. I have a question out of curiosity. You know, how might we think about boarding schools in Hawaii as possibly parallel kinds of institutionalizations? You know, boarding schools were not, there weren't many, but one of the most well known, of course, is the Kamehameha schools. Mostly, I mean, the border, the dorms were opened up, first of all, in order for students from outer islands to come to the school. Okay, and more recently, they've begun accepting boarders who were not necessarily outer island or rural Oahu. But you know, Kamehameha Schools has this long history of being industrial and home economics and vocational training until the 1980s when things totally flipped. And so, you know, as you spoke about Waialeʻe and Kawailoa, I couldn't help but wonder, you know, to what extent might boarding school experiences, uh, you know, what kind of parallel tracks might there be?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, mahalo nui for your question. And yeah, I mean, I'm still thinking through how to address that. I mean, in part, I feel like there's been, I mean, we still could use a lot more history on all of these things. So I'm not saying there's nothing left to write, but there has been writing about the history of Kamehameha schools and some of the other boarding schools like Lahaina Luna on Maui. Um, and I do think there's definitely a lot of kind of shared goals and aims with the so-called training that's happening at both these governmental training schools and Kamehameha and other boarding schools. I think probably a lot of the maybe even like the curriculum or kind of the goals and the ways that the teachers were taught to think about you know, so-called training these students for particular kinds of jobs in agriculture, right? Or the girls to like perform domestic labor. I think we're very shared. But I think maybe the difference, I'm still kind of like plumbing out to what extent there are major differences between the institutions. Although, I mean, the obvious one is that at the government training schools, the kids couldn't leave, right? That they couldn't return home to see their families. I mean, their families could visit them to some extent on certain days, right? But the is again, like I kind of mentioned at the beginning of the talk, that's why sometimes I have trouble even like calling them schools, right? Even though they were calling them schools, right? But really I don't think it's an overstatement to call them prisons, right? They were literally the precursor to juvenile detention in Hawaii, and that's how they functioned. And so I think, yeah, again, so it's not like saying that what happened at Kamehameha or other boarding schools wasn't bad or was like less bad necessarily, but that's, there was this kind of extra, there was this added layer of kind of forced coercion where kind of the choice, the freedom of these students was really limited in ways that that was unique to those institutions. So yeah, but I think, absolutely there are ways that all of this was working together in a way, right, to structure kind of the white settler norms in territorial Hawaii. And I think a lot more has been written about Kamehameha. I mean, in part because it's complicated, right? A lot of our families went to Kamehameha and we have feelings about Kamehameha, maybe. And, there's, at least today, there's some sense that, there's like privilege attached to going to Kamehameha, right? And I think, the history complicates that. But I guess what I'm trying to provide is kind of like kind of also the other side to those, these training schools that haven't had much written about them. So yeah, mahalo.
So Miley, there's a question in the chat from Alex Stern. I'll go ahead and read it. Hi, Miley. Thank you. Thank you for your important research in situating these carceral institutions in the context of white settler colonialism. I'm seeing so many similarities between California institutions where many sterilizations were carried out on youth of color, people with disabilities, and other groups that were marginalized and labeled. My question is, do you think about your research in terms of reproductive injustice, in terms of foreclosing the futures of Native Hawaiians? And also, have these spaces of incarceration and harm been reclaimed and memorialized in any ways? Thanks, Alex, for that question.
Yeah, thanks so much, Alex. Yeah, I think I'm still kind of, I mean, I definitely kind of see this work as partly about reproductive injustice. But yeah, I haven't, it's complicated in a sense, like, that I haven't really seen like hard records of like sterilizations in the same way that might have happened like in some of the contexts that you research so well. But I think kind of whether or not there's like actual sterilizations, right? The state, the Territory of Hawaiʻi in these in this era are definitely trying to control Native Hawaiian reproduction, whether like literally by segregating, women of childbearing age in these institutions for as long as they can, or by, kind of really interrupting and damaging just Native Hawaiian forms of kinship and belonging, right? And so I think absolutely there's a lot of connections to be made to issues of reproductive justice, and that's and coming to see that as like one of an important kind of body of scholarship and activism that I hope this work can connect to. And yeah, and I mean, the second part of your question kind of gets at like some of the work I would like to learn how to do, or connect with people in Hawaii to do together. Like these spaces in general have not been reclaimed or memorialized in any way, besides, like I kind of mentioned, they're kind of like seen as like haunted house places, or like, I guess it is a kind of cool reclamation that it seems like kids on the North Shore have like made Waialeʻe into a like unsanctioned skate park, and they've been like I think University of Hawaii has like recently kicked them out, or I don't know a lot about it, but someone was telling me about that, which I think is kind of a cool maybe a different cool way of memorializing the boys that were kept there before. But I think but yeah, in general, there really hasn't been a lot of recognition of these sites. I don't think this history is well known. I mean, a lot of the records, like I mentioned, they're just all kept in the Hawaii State Archives, and you know, it's hard to access them to some extent. I mean, you have to have a lot of time to go there and go through them all. And I think, and I mean, it's like I said before too, it's a difficult history. So it's like, it's hard, it's kind of hard to sit with. So I think there's a lot of reasons why there hasn't been a lot of work done on these places yet. But I also kind of feel like it's kind of time to try to figure out what we could do, right? And I think my role is just like one small part in kind of helping to bring some of this to light. And I'm hoping as I continue to do this research, I could connect with more folks in Hawaii who might be working on issues of abolition or reproductive justice, and or, you know, just kind of youth justice in general, and see what our community might want to do, you know, with knowing some of this history, and kind of, you know, figuring out together what we do about it.
Thanks, Miley. If there's, just to kind of remind folks, if you use the raise hand function, we can call on you and you can ask a question, or you can also include one in the chat. I actually have a follow-up question if I can jump in, or not so much a follow-up, but more of like a method question. So I was really struck by the research you were doing, the narrative. So you were kind of being able to to read through the archive. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that process of reading the archive, maybe against the, if you consider it kind of reading against the grain, because in another class we've been talking, that I'm teaching, we've been talking about Nayan Shao's stranger intimacy, and like what it means to look at these kind of criminal records and find these sort of historical examples of same-sex intimacy. And so when you were talking about the school in which there were these you know, same-sex relations, queer relations, I wondered about like what was the process of discovering those stories, and just the relationship to the archive, what the archive looks like and so on in this project.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, I'm still, so I'm still really in the thick of like getting through the archival materials. Like I've made a couple trips to the Hawaii State Archives, and then I just have all these photos that I'm trying to organize and really read through. And but yeah, I mean, it's tricky, kind of like your question is pointing out, right, to read the archive against the grain. I mean, we can't really like trust the archive because it's written by the, you know, settler administrators of these very settler institutions. But at the same time, I think, you know, what they write and how they write it can tell us a lot, maybe inadvertently, by what they don't say, or, you know, how they're saying things. So yeah, with the example of kind of the like fears of lesbian relationships at Kawailoa, you know, the things in the archive that point to that are literally like reports. So like each of these institutions basically had to do like a monthly report that they sent back to their like governing board. And so in a lot of those reports, there's like list of the number of runaways, or, you know, whatever was happening at the institution that month. And so along with those reports, they're just kind of like, yeah, notes about like their concerns about homosexual relationships. There's like notes of like the superintendents bringing in like, again, like kind of experts from University of Hawaii at Manoa to like lecture to the girls about like why homosexuality is bad, or like how to avoid it or something like that. And then, yeah, and then it comes up in like their official like handbooks of like, you know, when the girls arrive, they're given this little handbook with all their rules, and some of the rules are like don't get too close to other girls, like don't cut your hair in a dyke haircut, or what, you know, whatever. So I think, yeah, so far, you know, it's really by my ability to get at kind of the ways that children like resisted and went against you know, the desires of the institution, to some extent, it's pretty easy because all the reports are like so concerned about like the runaways and the lesbians and, you know, but it's also, you know, it also leaves a lot to be desired. Like I would really love to hear like a very full firsthand account from one of those girls about their life. And so, and I mean, I did have that to some extent with that story that I opened with Dorothy Wu, just because she gave this very kind of long like life history interview to a sociologist, again, at the University of Hawaii. But those are kind of far and few between. So yeah, I'm always kind of like really happy to find more kind of firsthand accounts, although they're also kind of, you know, constrained by the conditions in which those interviews were given. But that's kind of the archive we have, is the settler archive, right? So that at least that's the archive that I've been working with so far. But that's also to say that, so there are also, as many other Hawaiian scholars, you know, have shown, we do have a really huge archive of Hawaiian language newspapers, where I expect there might also be accounts about, you know, children being sent to these schools or families having to deal with those schools, which I'm currently kind of trying to improve my Hawaiian language skill enough that I could draw on those sources as well. And then again, I'm also kind of, I'm at the very beginning of thinking about how to do this, but I would also love to eventually be able to do some kind of public history project or some kind of oral history project with, you know, even if the people who might have been at that schools are probably largely passed away by now, but I think there are a lot of stories that get passed down through families about their ancestors who had to go to some of these schools. So yeah, so those are, thanks for your question. Those are some of the ways that I'm still very much like thinking through it.
Yeah, thanks so much, Miley. There are a couple of comments. Maybe I can kind of go ahead and read them. There are comments in the chat. There were a couple that came up during the presentation, so I don't know the context in which they came, or like if there was on a specific point. So I'll just kind of work backwards. So this is a comment from Demiliza Saramosing. I apologize if I mispronounced your name. Mahalo nui, Miley, for this very important presentation. I'm really interested in the relationships made between Hawaiian children and other children of color in these institutions. I'm also really interested in the focus of youth and the creation of collective resistance cultures. I'm wondering if at this moment you're able to locate cross-racial youth coalition cultures in the archive. Mahalo.
Yeah, thanks so much, Demiliza, for coming and for your comments and questions. Yeah, I think, yeah, at this point, I haven't seen like any like very like formal thing that I would be able to call like a kind of resistance, like cross-cultural resistance among at the schools. But I'm still very much working through it. So I think it's possible that it's there. And I mean, I think to some extent, like, you know, like, so the young woman that I opened with, she's Native Hawaiian, but she's also Chinese, right? And so to some extent, a lot of these children themselves are, you know, multiracial, and so and kind of have different, make different choices regarding like how they identified or who they identify with more, which is also kind of constrained by the settler colonial context, right? So like Dorothy Wu and the rest of her interview, she talks a lot about like, I don't know, not wanting to be Hawaiian or wanting to seem more Chinese because like in her account, like Chinese are so-called smarter than Hawaiians, right? So I think there's a lot of like complicated ways that like Hawaiian and other cultures in Hawaii are relating to each other in both like coalitional ways and kind of like sometimes still like beset by or buying into some of the settler hierarchies that are being placed on Hawaiians and Chinese and Japanese and other folks. but yeah, so yeah, I'm really interested to as I get through more of the archival materials to see what else emerges. But definitely, I mean, I think the running away seemed, I mean, it was like all of the children, like almost all of the children at all of the institutions ran away at some point, right? And so I think that speaks to like um, there must have been like ways that, you know, knowledge about how to run away was like passed among them, right? Or it was passed down and shared and kind of supported among all the children who were there. So I think, yeah, so I guess the answer is like, I haven't necessarily seen it written in such a way that I could like formally identify it, but I do think, again, like, because so far I'm really reading the settler archive against the grain, there are definitely many places where you can kind of infer like what had to have been happening there at these institutions. So yeah, thanks again.
Oh, great. There's a question in the Q&A function
Okay.
from Kehaulani Vaughn. Thank you for this work. Did these institutions, the state ones, consider Christianity central to their missions? Were practices of Christianity instituted as part of their curriculum? Since the heteropatriarchal practice of marriage was considered a success for these girls in order to be released from these places, I see a lot of parallels with other places that incarcerated with Indigenous children and youth.
Yeah. Mahalo, Kehau. Yeah, I think absolutely. I think Christianity was kind of embedded in the government training schools. I mean, definitely in other like private institutions like Salvation Army, right? That Christianity was like very much part of the training at a Salvation Army homeschool, but definitely Christianity was also part of the training schools. And so, yeah, in the records, I definitely see like evidence of like notes about how there were services held at every week at each of the training schools. Although it's interesting, I think at least in a certain period, there did seem to be like a plurality of denominations that were allowed to come and preach at the schools. So I think there were like I think the children could like identify themselves as like being Catholic or Protestant, and then like on a certain day, like the Catholic priest would come and give a service, and the Catholic children could go to that one, and then the Protestant children could go to the Protestant service on another day. So it was kind of like I think, and I did even see at just some little remark about them allowing like a Buddhist service to happen occasionally as well, likely for like the Japanese children at the schools. So I think it's kind of like absolutely yes, like a lot of these ideas, especially about marriage and heteropatriarchy, were very much Christian, and in different ways the children were encouraged to practice like be part of these like religious services, but like in a weird way, at least in the records I've seen so far, it did seem to be kind of open about like at least domination, and to some extent even like tolerated Buddhist practices. But yeah, but yeah, I definitely still think even if they were like able to tolerate Buddhist practices, they were very much in keeping with kind of the enforcing like heteropatriarchal white Christian ideas on these children, and very much like the other like boarding schools in the Native American context as well. But yeah, thank you.
There's another question from Kylie Wilson. Would you consider the schools in Kalaupapa to be institutions similar to those in Oahu?
Yeah, thanks, Kylie. I think that's a really great question too. And I know one of my former advisors, Adria Amata, I'm not sure if her new book is out yet, or it's maybe just coming out, but she has a new book about Kalaupapa. And so I have talked to her a little bit about how Yeah, definitely kind of the institutionalization that is happening at Kalaupapa, where like, so for folks who don't know, Kalaupapa is this remote part of the island of Molokai, and people who contracted leprosy in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they were often forcibly like removed, like kind of basically arrested and taken to this remote so-called leper colony at Kalaupapa. And yeah, in conversation with Adria, she notes that there were a lot of like transfers from maybe directly from these schools to Kalaupapa. So again, that's kind of a different like transfer and trans-institutionalization that could happen among these territorial schools. And so yeah, I don't know a lot about like if there were like curriculum taught at Kalaupapa, but I imagine that you know, these ideas of like kind of rehabilitating people, like making them useful to society. I imagine that some of those ideologies were prevalent at Kalaupapa as well. And I do think you know, I've found kind of knowing just a little bit about Kalaupapa and kind of like the ways that Native Hawaiians really resisted their family members being taken to Kalaupapa. Like I think that that example tells kind of makes me believe that there would also be resistance to institutionalization of children in these other institutions, if that makes sense, right? So so yeah, I think the Kalaupapa example is really useful and is kind of interacting with these histories in important ways. Mahalo.
There's a question, Miley, in the chat from Stephanie Tevez. Institutions like these often have directors and board members who are listed in reports. What race / ethnicity / nationality were many of the teachers and officials, etc.? Are we to assume that they were mostly Haole, or how did other POC or even Kanaka work to discipline the children?
Yeah, mahalo, Lani. Yeah, my sense, again, it's my kind of partial sense still going through the archive is that, yeah, all the directors and board members are Haole throughout the history of these institutions. But yes, I think sometimes the teachers and house mothers or other kinds of staff on the grounds of the schools, like kind of like, I don't know, security guards or like, you know, other kind of like maintenance people, that they were Kanaka or other people of color. And yeah, I think that's a question that I'm still thinking through too, is like how to understand the role of that those kind of folks played within these institutions. I mean, I think sometimes, again, this is like from reading against the grain of these settler archives, like some of those staff like enabled the children, right, to run away, or you know, like, because yeah, there's like at Waialeʻe there's some report of like oh, they thought like, you know, some night watchman like wasn't doing his job very well because the kids kept running away. They thought like maybe he kept letting them run away, or he's, you know, things like that. So there, I mean, it's complicated, right? That I think Kanaka could have worked at these institutions, but they might have had their own reasons or their own ways of being in these institutions that did not totally like go along with those institutions' aims, right? And yeah, I mean, another reason I got into this project is partly because my own tutu, my grandmother, worked at you know, at a much later iteration than what I'm talking about, but like in the 70s and 80s and 90s, she worked at at the girls' home, right? Which I think, I'm not sure, I don't think it was called Kawailoa anymore, but it was still kind of called the girls' home, and it was maybe more formally part of like the juvenile justice system. But she was like it was still like the same buildings. I think the same buildings are still there now, but she was like a house mother, right? And so, so that's like another way that I came to know about these institutions, is like literally the family connection and stories to it, which yeah, which is complicated and sometimes troubling, but it feels like yeah, it just feels like we need to know more about what happened here, and how to maybe how to like sit with the legacies, or what to do about the legacies of it.
I think we probably have time for one more question, if that's all right, finally.
Yeah. Oh yeah, thanks, Amy. Yes, it was called Ko'olau Girls Home after. Yeah. The reports on that home is so funny that they're always trying to like not say that it's in Kailua, which is like the more wealthy white town. They're always trying to say it's like in Manawili. Well, Manawili is also kind of wealthy, but they always try to describe it as in Olomana or Waimanalo, even though so Waimanalo is the more Native Hawaiian town where my family is from. But they're always trying to say that the girls' home is in Waimanalo, even though like just literally if you look at a map, it's literally in Kailua. So it's kind of funny. Some of the name changes and all of that is related to kind of, I think, some of the stigma about the home and its location.
Well, if there are no more questions, unfortunately, well, I'll clap for you. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I'm sure everyone's clapping at home. And I really appreciate this. Thank you so much for such a wonderful, there's standing ovation in the chat.
Oh, thank you.
Applause, everyone's applauding. Yeah, thank you so much. This is really exciting research, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how it develops, and yeah, seeing you present on it again. Thank you so much.
Oh yeah, thanks so much for having me, and yeah, thanks to everyone for coming.